In hospice, the last day often arrives quietly. Not with speeches, not with answers, but with a slowing of the world. I've learned that what matters most in those hours isn't what we say to fill the space, but how we stay inside it. 24 hours before death, people rarely talk about the things we expect. They don't reach for big meanings. They notice small truths, a familiar voice, a hand being held. The comfort of not being alone. Words become fewer, softer, and sometimes they disappear altogether. And in that silence, something honest shows up. This story isn't about drama or fear. It's about presence, about what someone chose to share when energy was limited and time felt different. It's about how the end can strip life down to what was always important but easy to miss when we were busy. As you listen, take a breath. Let the pace slow. This is a space where nothing needs fixing, only noticing, only being here. I want to tell you about Michael, but not the version people imagine when they hear the word death. Not the dramatic moment, not the last breath. I want to tell you about the day before, the 24 hours when life is still here, but already loosening its grip. Those hours are different. Time behaves differently. People behave differently. And words, when they come, tend to be honest in a way they haven't been before. When I walked into his room that morning, the light was soft. Not bright, not dark, just enough to see his face without waking him fully. Hospice rooms often feel like that, as if the light itself knows how gently it should enter. Michael's eyes were half open. He wasn't asleep, but he wasn't fully here either. That space in between is familiar to me now. It's where many people begin to spend their final day. I greeted him the same way I always do. Quietly, no rush, no need to announce myself. He looked at me and there was recognition, but it moved slowly, like it had to travel a long distance to reach his eyes. I asked how he was feeling, not because I expected a clear answer, but because sometimes the question itself is a form of care. He didn't answer right away. His breathing was steady, shallow, but calm. Then he said, very softly, "I think I'm done fighting." It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't sad in the way people expect sadness to sound. It was more like someone putting down a heavy bag they'd been carrying for too long. There was relief in his voice. Not relief that life was ending, but relief that the struggle was. In hospice, when someone says something like that, we don't correct them. We don't encourage them to be strong. We don't tell them to keep going. We listen. Because those words are usually the truest thing they've said in weeks, I sat down beside him. Not to ask questions, just to be there. Presence matters more than language in these moments. Michael closed his eyes again, and after a while he spoke. "Did I do enough?" That question shows up often near the end. Not always in those exact words, but in different shapes. Did I matter? Did I love well? Did I leave something behind? I've learned not to answer it with reassurance right away. Sometimes people aren't asking for an answer. They're saying the question out loud because it's been sitting inside them for years. I asked him what he meant. He smiled faintly, almost apologetically. "I don't mean work," he said. "I mean people." That told me everything. At the end, almost no one talks about achievements. They talk about relationships, or the absence of them, or the moments they wish they'd stayed longer in. I reminded him of what I knew, the people who had visited, the way he spoke about them, the care I'd seen reflected back toward him. He listened, but I could tell he wasn't measuring his life by my words. He was measuring it by his own internal scale, one that only shows itself at the end. Later that morning, his sister came in. Their conversations were slow. Pauses stretched long between sentences, and no one tried to fill them. That's another thing people learn at the end. Silence doesn't need to be fixed. At one point, she asked him if he was afraid. He shook his head. "I'm tired," he said. "That's different," she cried quietly. He reached for her hand, not with urgency, but with intention. Touch becomes very deliberate near the end. Every movement costs energy, so people don't waste it. When she stepped out for a moment, he looked at me again. "Do you think it's okay to let go before everyone's ready?" he asked. That question comes from love. People worry about leaving too soon, about causing pain by stopping. I told him what I believe based on years of watching this moment arrive again and again, that letting go is not something we do to others. It's something the body knows how to do when it's time, and that love doesn't disappear just because the body rests. He nodded, like something inside him had settled. As the day went on, Michael spoke less. Not because he couldn't, but because he didn't need to. His eyes followed the room sometimes, the ceiling, the window. Small details that suddenly seem important when everything else falls away. In the afternoon, he surprised me by saying, "It's quiet inside now." I asked what he meant. "The noise," he said, "the worrying, it stopped." That's something I've heard many times, and it still humbles me every time. People spend their lives carrying mental noise, regret, fear, plans, unfinished conversations, and then often in the last day, it softens. Not because everything is resolved, but because it no longer needs to be. I adjusted his blankets. He thanked me, then paused. "Thank you for not rushing me," he added. That stayed with me. Because hospice is not about rushing. It's about allowing slowness, allowing uncertainty, allowing people to be exactly where they are without trying to move them somewhere else. As evening came, the room grew quieter. His breathing changed slightly, nothing alarming, just different. He hadn't eaten much all day. That's normal. Hunger fades, thirst becomes more about comfort than need. We moistened his lips, kept him comfortable. He opened his eyes again and said, "I can hear my mother." I asked gently if he meant her voice. He nodded. "She's not saying anything." Hallucinations aren't the right word for moments like these. They're experiences. Personal, meaningful, often comforting. I didn't correct him. I didn't ask questions. I just said, "That sounds peaceful." He smiled, a real smile, not big, but genuine. That night, I sat with him longer than usual. Not because he needed something medically, but because something in the room asked for stillness. He spoke once more. "Tell them I wasn't scared," he said. I asked who he meant. "Anyone what?" "Oh, wonders," he replied. Those were among the last clear words he spoke. Not about pain, not about fear, not about unfinished business. Just a simple truth he wanted carried forward. After that, his speech faded into murmurs, then into silence. But it wasn't empty. It was full in a way that's hard to explain unless you've been there, full of breath, full of presence, full of a sense that something important was happening without needing to be named. Throughout the night, he drifted in and out. Sometimes his eyes opened. Sometimes they didn't. His body was doing what bodies do when they're nearing the end, conserving energy, turning inward. I watched his face soften, lines that had been tight relaxed, his jaw unclenched. There's a moment I often notice in the final day when someone looks younger again, not because they're healing, but because they're no longer holding themselves up against the world. Near early morning, he squeezed my hand. Weakly, but intentionally. "Stay," he whispered. So I did. Not because I was needed in a technical sense, but because no one should feel alone when the world is becoming unfamiliar. We don't always remember words at the end, but we remember how it felt to be accompanied. He didn't say anything else after that. But if you asked me what Michael said 24 hours before his death, I wouldn't just tell you the words. I would tell you how they sounded, how they were shaped by quiet, how they came from a place deeper than conversation. He said he was done fighting. He asked if he had done enough. He said the noise had stopped. He asked if it was okay to let go. He wanted people to know he wasn't scared. And in between those sentences, there was so much unsaid. Gratitude, release, love without language. That's what the last day often holds. Not answers, not closure in the way movies show it, but honesty softened by time, spoken only when it truly needs to be spoken. That is what 24 hours before death often sounds like. Not loud, not dramatic, just human, just true. Not the words Michael said, but everything that happened when words slowly stepped aside. Because in the final day, silence isn't empty. It becomes a language of its own, and if you know how to listen, it says more than conversation ever could. There is a point, usually within the last 24 hours, when people stop trying to explain themselves. They stop narrating their lives. They stop reaching for the right sentence. It's not because they have nothing left to say. It's because the need to say, it disappears. Michael reached that place gradually, like someone walking into fog without realizing how far they've gone. In the morning, there were still words, gentle ones, careful ones. But as the hours passed, the space between his sentences grew longer. At first, people around him worried about that. They leaned closer, repeated questions, tried to pull him back into conversation. I've learned not to do that. Silence near the end isn't a problem to solve. It's a transition to respect. By midday, Michael would open his eyes, look around the room, and then close them again without speaking. and that was enough. His breathing told the story, slow, rhythmic, unforced. His face was relaxed in a way it hadn't been before. There was no tension in his brow, no restlessness in his hands. The body often knows before the mind that words are no longer necessary. I sat with him while nothing happened, and that nothing was actually full of meaning. Every small sound became noticeable. The hum of the oxygen, the soft shift of sheets when he moved, the quiet footsteps in the hallway. When someone is dying, the world gets quieter, not because sound disappears, but because attention sharpens. At one point, someone asked me if he was still with us. That question always catches something fragile, because presence doesn't look the same near the end. Michael was with us, but not in the way people expect. He wasn't tracking conversations. He wasn't responding on cue, but he was still sensing, still receiving. I spoke to him softly, even when he didn't respond. I told him what I was doing before touching him. I told him who was in the room. Not because he needed the information, but because tone matters. Even when words fade, the way they are spoken still reaches something deep. As the afternoon light shifted, his eyes opened again. He didn't speak, he just looked at me for a long moment, and in that look there was recognition, trust, and something like gratitude. It's hard to describe, but if you've seen it, you know it. A look that says, I know you're here. A look that doesn't need anything else. Silence does something to time. Minutes stretch. Hours lose their edges. There's no urgency, no schedule that matters anymore. Michael wasn't waiting for anything. He was resting inside the moment as it was. In the evening, his sister returned and sat beside him. She held his hand. At first, she talked. She told stories. She reminded him of memories they shared. That's natural. People talk because they're afraid silence means absence, but slowly she stopped. Not because she ran out of things to say, but because she realized he didn't need the stories anymore. They sat together without speaking for a long time, and something shifted in her body when she allowed that. Her shoulders dropped. Her breathing slowed. Silence gave her permission to stop performing comfort and simply be present. Michael's grip on her hand was light, but steady. Every so often, his fingers moved just slightly. That was his language now, not sentences. Sensation, touch, rhythm. Later, when she stepped out, I stayed. The room felt settled, like it had reached a natural still point. Michael's breathing changed again. A little slower, a little deeper. The pauses between breaths lengthened. Not in a frightening way, but in a deliberate one. He didn't open his eyes much after that. When he did, there was no searching in them. No confusion. Just a soft awareness. I spoke his name once, quietly. He didn't respond with words, but his breathing shifted as if he'd heard me. People often think silence at the end means someone is gone already, but that isn't true. Silence is often when they are most inwardly present. The outer world becomes less important. The inner world takes over. I've seen people who talk nonstop for years become quiet in their final day, and I've seen quiet people become even quieter, like they're folding themselves gently back into something familiar. Michael was doing that. Folding inward, letting go of the effort it takes to interact. As night settled in, the room felt almost suspended. The lights were low, the sounds were minimal. Michael didn't speak again, but he communicated in other ways. A slight turn of the head, a soft exhale when someone touched his arm, a relaxation in his face when the room was calm. I watched his body do what it needed to do without interference. That's an important part of hospice, knowing when not to act, knowing when comfort means stillness, not adjustment. At one point, I thought about how much of life is spent filling silence, explaining ourselves, defending ourselves, entertaining others, and how at the very end, none of that matters. Silence becomes safe. Silence becomes honest. Michael's final day wasn't marked by a final speech. It was marked by long stretches of quiet where nothing needed to be said, where presence was enough, where being there mattered more than doing anything. Even when he could no longer respond, I stayed aware of the energy in the room. Calm voices, slow movements, no rushing, because silence can be disrupted just as easily as speech, and it deserves the same care. Near the early morning hours, his breathing softened further. His chest rose and fell with effort now, but there was no struggle, no tension, just the body easing into its own rhythm. I held his hand, not tightly, just enough for him to feel contact if he still could. In silence, touch speaks clearly. It says you are not alone. It says you are allowed to rest. There was a moment when everything in the room felt very still. Not heavy, not sad, just still. Those moments are hard to explain, but they happen. A sense that something is aligning, that nothing more is required. Michael didn't say goodbye. He didn't need to. The silence had already done that work. It had held everything that words couldn't carry. When people ask me what the final day is like, I often tell them this. It's quieter than you expect, and that quiet isn't empty or frightening. It's full of meaning, full of permission, full of a kind of peace that doesn't announce itself loudly. Silence in those hours becomes a companion. It wraps around the room, it softens edges. It allows everyone present to stop trying to manage the moment and simply witness it. Michael's final day was shaped by that silence. Not as absence, but as presence. Not as loss, but as transition. Not as something missing, but as something settling into place. And in that quiet, there was nothing left that needed to be said. I want to speak about what changed inside Michael during that final day. Not in a visible way, but in a quiet, internal one. Because the last 24 hours are not only about what the body does, they're about what the heart releases, often without words, often without witnesses noticing until later. Early that morning, before he said much at all, I noticed something subtle. His face no longer carried the guarded expression I had seen days earlier. When people are still trying to stay alive, there is a kind of holding that happens in the face, in the jaw, in the eyes. It's not conscious. It's the body bracing itself. That bracing was gone. In its place was something softer, as if he no longer needed to protect himself from what was coming. When I adjusted his pillow, he didn't flinch. When I moved the blankets, he didn't tense. These are small things, but they tell a story. The body relaxes when it stops arguing with reality, and that relaxation often begins before the person can explain it. Michael didn't talk about acceptance directly. People rarely do. Acceptance isn't a sentence. It's a shift, and you can feel it in the room when it happens. The air feels calmer. The energy feels less restless. Even visitors sense it, though they might not know why. At one point, someone asked him if he wanted the television on. He shook his head slowly. Too much, he said. That wasn't about noise. It was about distraction. When the end is near, people often turn away from things that pull them outward. The world becomes simpler, quieter, narrower. And that narrowing isn't a loss. It's a focusing. Throughout the day, Michael seemed less concerned with time. Earlier in his stay, he had asked what day it was, what time it was, how long things would take. On this day, he didn't ask once. Time was no longer something he needed to manage. He wasn't planning ahead anymore. He was inhabiting the present moment fully, even if that moment was mostly stillness. In the afternoon, a volunteer came by briefly and spoke to him gently. Michael didn't respond with words, but his eyes opened and followed the sound of the voice. That told me something important. Even when speech fades, connection does not. The need to be acknowledged doesn't disappear. It simply changes form. After the volunteer left, Michael whispered, "People have been kind." That sentence held a lot. It wasn't about gratitude in a formal sense. It was more like a realization, as if he had taken inventory of his life and found more gentleness than he expected. Near the end, people often review their lives internally, not as a series of events, but as a feeling. Was life harsh or gentle? Was it lonely or shared? Was love present or absent? Michael seemed to be resting in the awareness that kindness had reached him, even here. Later, when I offered him medication for comfort, he hesitated. "Will it make me sleep?" he asked. I told him it might make him more relaxed. "That's okay," he said. "I don't need to stay awake." That sentence wasn't about medication. It was about permission. Permission to stop monitoring. Permission to stop witnessing. Permission to let the body take over without supervision. Many people feel they have to stay alert at the end, as if rest might cause them to miss something important. But there comes a moment when staying awake no longer serves a purpose. Michael had reached that moment. As evening approached, the room felt less like a hospital space and more like a quiet threshold. The equipment faded into the background. The focus shifted entirely to him, to his breathing, to his presence. He didn't speak much after that, but when he did, his words were simple. "I'm okay," he said once. When someone asked how he was, not fine, not good, Just okay. That word carries a lot near the end. It means not resisting. It means not suffering unnecessarily. It means being where you are without needing it to be different. As the light outside dimmed, his eyes closed more often than they opened. When they did open, there was no urgency in them, no searching, just a gentle awareness that flickered and then rested again. I noticed that his hands, which had been restless earlier in the week, were now still, palms open, fingers relaxed. The body often mirrors what the mind has already decided. Letting go shows up physically before it becomes obvious emotionally. Someone asked me quietly if he knew what was happening. That question comes from fear, not from fact. Knowing doesn't always look like understanding in words. Knowing can be a deep internal recognition that doesn't require explanation. Michael knew. Not in a way that could be charted or measured, but in a way that showed itself through calm. As night settled in, the room grew even quieter. The sounds of the building softened, fewer footsteps, fewer voices. Michael's breathing became the main rhythm, like a slow tide moving in and out. I stayed close, watching for discomfort, for signs of distress. There were none. His body was doing its work with dignity, without struggle. At one point, his brow furrowed slightly, and I leaned closer, thinking he might be in pain. He opened his eyes briefly and said, I'm just remembering. I didn't ask what. Memories at the end are private. They don't need an audience. Whatever he was revisiting belonged to him. After that, his face smoothed again, and he drifted deeper into rest. In the quiet hours, there is often a sense that the room itself is holding its breath, not in anticipation, but in respect. The usual rules feel suspended. No one rushes. No one speaks loudly. Movements become intentional. I thought about how much effort it takes to live in the world, to keep up, to respond, to perform, and how, in these final hours, all of that falls away. What remains is the person beneath the roles. Michael was no longer a patient in those moments. He was simply a human being nearing the end of a human experience. His breathing changed again, slower now, with longer pauses. Each breath seemed deliberate, as if chosen rather than automatic. This often happens near the end. The body conserves energy, taking only what it needs. I spoke his name softly once more, no response, but his breathing didn't change in a startled way. It remained steady. That told me he wasn't distressed. Touch became the primary form of communication. A hand resting on his arm, a gentle adjustment of the blanket. These actions spoke more clearly than words ever could. At some point in the night, I realized that Michael was no longer holding on to anything. Not fear, not regret, not expectation. There was a sense of completion, even without resolution. People often think closure is something we achieve before death. In my experience, closure is rare. What's more common is release. A quiet uncoupling from the need to understand everything. Michael didn't try to make sense of his life in those final hours. He simply inhabited it, right up to the edge. The room felt steady, calm, almost tender. This is something people don't expect. They expect intensity. They expect grief to fill the space. But often, what fills it instead is a deep stillness that feels almost sacred. I continued to sit with him, watching, listening, breathing in rhythm with the room. Nothing needed to be done. Nothing needed to be said. His breathing softened further, each breath taking its time, as if moving toward rest rather than away from it. In those hours, I'm always aware that what matters most is not intervention, but witness. To be there, to honor the moment by not interrupting it. Michael's final day was not marked by fear or struggle. It was marked by a gradual turning inward, a gentle loosening of attachment to the outer world. He didn't announce that he was ready. He didn't declare acceptance. He simply embodied it. And that embodiment spoke louder than any final words ever could.